Only a bare-bones crew remains at this Manhattan construction site, where work on the nation's largest infrastructure project has ground to a halt. The Trump administration stopped allocating funding for the $16 billion project, a new tunnel for a railway line, back in October.
Underneath the most photographed building in the world, below the press briefings and the state dinners and the carefully managed public image, there is a tunnel system that no sitting president has ever officially acknowledged. Construction workers have found it, historians have documented pieces of it, and the official record has gone quiet every single time. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Every major mystery in American history has a moment when the official story and the physical evidence stop agreeing with each other. With the White House, that moment is not a single event. It is a pattern, a persistent, decades-long pattern of discoveries, documents, and departures from the official record that adds up to something the mainstream account has never been able to fully explain. The White House sits at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C., on 18 acres of federal land that have been continuously occupied by the executive branch since 1800. The building above ground has been exhaustively documented. Its architecture, its renovations, its Secret Service installations, its underground bunker added after the September 11th attacks. There is an official White House Historical Association, an official curator, official tours, official everything. But the ground beneath the White House is a different matter, because what has been found there, what continues to be found there, and what the federal government consistently declines to discuss in any detail, tells a story about the building and the people who built it that the official history has never been willing to tell straight. The publicly acknowledged infrastructure beneath the White House includes the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the PEOC, which was significantly expanded after the 1994 crash of a small plane onto the White House grounds, and again after September 11th, 2001. There is a tunnel connecting the White House to the Eisenhower Executive Office building next door, installed during the Truman administration's renovation of the 1950s. There is a tunnel connecting to the Treasury Department. These are documented, occasionally referenced in official statements, and generally attributed to Cold War-era emergency planning. What the official record does not explain is what workers found during the Truman renovation itself. Between 1949 and 1952, the White House underwent the most extensive renovation in its history. The building was essentially gutted to its exterior walls. Every interior wall was demolished. The entire structure was rebuilt on a new steel and concrete foundation. And in the process of excavating that foundation, construction crews encountered tunnel and chamber structures that were older than the renovation, older than the Cold War planning that supposedly explained them, and older, in some documented cases, than any federal infrastructure program that would have put them there. The renovation records from that period are incomplete in ways that are not typical of major federal construction projects of that era. On sections of the engineering documentation are missing, cost overruns that were never fully explained in congressional testimony, and a level of secrecy around what was found during excavation that was unusual even by the classified standards of the early Cold War. To understand what might explain structures beneath the White House that predate the known construction record, you need to understand the ground itself. The White House sits on land that was inhabited long before European colonization. The Nacotchtank people, an Algonquian-speaking group, lived along the Potomac River for centuries before the first European settlers arrived in the early 1600s. Their settlements included the area that would eventually become Washington, D.C. The Nacotchtank were known to have constructed underground storage facilities, ceremonial spaces, and passage systems that connected settlements along the river. The archaeological record for these structures is fragmentary because European colonization disrupted the communities before systematic documentation was possible. But the structures existed. By the time Pierre-Charles L'Enfant designed the federal city in 1791, the land had changed hands multiple times. It had been farmed, grazed, and partially cleared. But the underground features of the original inhabitants were not mapped, not documented, and not accounted for in L'Enfant's plans. They were simply built over, which means that whatever existed beneath the surface before 1791 was incorporated into the substrate of the new capital without any official knowledge of what it was. This is not speculation. Archaeologists working on other federal projects in Washington have consistently found pre-colonial underground features at depths and in locations that were not predicted by the official historical record. The assumption that the White House grounds would be an exception to this pattern has no evidentiary basis. It is simply an assumption. The first documented anomaly in the White House underground record comes from 1814. After British forces burned the White House during the War of 1812, reconstruction began under architect James Hoban, who had built the original structure. Workers clearing the burned debris and preparing the foundation for reconstruction reported finding underground chambers and passage sections that did not correspond to any construction that had been done on the building since 1800. The contemporary accounts of these findings are fragmentary. They exist in private letters and in a handful of newspaper reports from the period, not in official government documentation, because in 1814, there was no systematic federal process for documenting construction anomalies. But the accounts are specific enough to be taken seriously. Multiple independent sources describe the same thing. Passages running in directions that do not correspond to the known footprint of the original White House. Chambers with walls of a construction technique that the workers did not recognize as typical of American building practice of the era. Where did those passages go? The accounts do not say definitively, but the directions mentioned in the most detailed of the contemporary letters point toward the Potomac River and toward the Capitol building, which was still under construction at the time. A passage running toward the Capitol is not inherently implausible. The federal city was built by a small group of closely connected people with enormous financial and political stakes in its success. The idea that informal or unofficial construction might have connected key federal buildings early in the Capitol's history, before the formal records of such construction became standardized, is consistent with how that era's construction and planning actually worked. The most technically detailed evidence for anomalous underground structures beneath the White House comes not from historical accounts, but from geophysical survey data. Ground-penetrating radar technology, which uses electromagnetic waves to map subsurface features without excavation, has been used extensively on federal land in Washington for infrastructure planning purposes. In the early 2000s, sections of geophysical survey data from the White House grounds became available through Freedom of Information Act requests filed by researchers at two separate institutions. The data showed subsurface anomalies at multiple depths that could not be fully accounted for by the known infrastructure. Cavities and linear features at depths between 15 and 40 feet in locations that did not correspond to documented utility lines, drainage systems, or known tunnel installations. The federal government's response to inquiries about these anomalies was consistent. The relevant agencies acknowledged that geophysical surveys had been conducted for infrastructure planning purposes. They declined to provide interpretation of the anomalies identified, and they cited national security exemptions when pressed for more detailed information about what the surveys had found. That response pattern is itself informative. National security exemptions are applied to information whose disclosure could create security risks. The application of those exemptions to geophysical survey data about cavities in the ground suggests that whoever is making classification decisions believes there is something beneath the White House worth protecting information about. That is a different posture than simply saying the anomalies are known infrastructure features that have been misidentified. The question of who built anything that might predate the official construction record opens into a dimension of American history that is rarely discussed directly. Washington, D.C. was built substantially by enslaved labor. The historical record of that labor is incomplete in ways that are not accidental. The people who did the physical work of constructing the Capitol, digging its foundations, clearing its land, laying its stone, were legally property. Their work was not documented with the same systematic attention that was given to the work of free architects, engineers, and contractors. This matters for the underground question because it means that construction activities which were not part of the official plan, which were done off the record for reasons that the slaveholders directing the work did not want formally documented, it could have occurred without leaving the kind of paper trail that would show up in federal archives. If passages were dug beneath the White House or connecting federal buildings in the early years of the Capitol's existence, and if that digging was done by enslaved people under the direction of people who had reasons not to document it, the absence of official records is exactly what you would expect. It is not evidence that nothing happened. It is evidence of how that era's record-keeping worked. The Underground Railroad, the network of routes and safe houses that helped enslaved people escape to freedom, operated in Washington throughout the antebellum period. The Capitol was a slave-holding city with a significant free black population and an active abolitionist presence. Historical research has documented that the Underground Railroad used physical infrastructure in Washington, including cellars, passages, and connection points between buildings, in ways that were never officially acknowledged, because acknowledgement would have been legally dangerous for everyone involved. Whether any of that infrastructure connected to or passed beneath the White House is a question that historical research has raised, but not conclusively answered. What is documented is that the antebellum White House was a building where enslaved people lived and worked, where the boundary between the official and unofficial worlds was crossed constantly, and where the physical infrastructure of the building served purposes that were never fully entered into any official record. In 1992, during renovation work on the White House grounds, workers encountered a section of brick tunnel that did not appear on any blueprint on file with the National Park Service, which manages the White House grounds. The discovery was reported internally. A section of the tunnel was documented by photographs, and then the information went into a classification process from which it has not fully emerged. What is known about that 1992 discovery comes from two sources: a partial Freedom of Information Act release that described the discovery in general terms without providing the photographs or the engineering assessment, and the account of a contractor who worked on the renovation and who spoke to researchers investigating the underground question in the mid-2000s, identifying himself only by his first name and declining to provide documentation because of a non-disclosure agreement he had signed. The contractor's account described a tunnel section running beneath the north lawn of the White House at a depth of approximately 20 feet with brick construction that the historical architects consulted dated to the mid-19th century. The tunnel was partially collapsed and partially intact. It ran in a direction, according to the contractor, that pointed toward Lafayette Square, the park directly north of the White House, and toward H Street beyond it. H Street in the mid-19th century was the location of several significant buildings connected to the political and intelligence apparatus of the antebellum federal government. The connection between the White House and that corridor of buildings through a passage that was never officially documented would be, if confirmed, consistent with the pattern of unofficial infrastructure that served the political and security needs of the early American state without entering the formal record. The pattern across all of these episodes is the same. Something is found. It is documented internally. The documentation is classified or withheld. and the official public response is either silence or a narrow acknowledgement that declines to address what was actually found. This pattern is not consistent with the explanation that the anomalies are simply known infrastructure that has been misidentified by outside researchers. Known infrastructure does not require national security exemptions. Known infrastructure can be pointed to and explained. The consistent refusal to explain, the consistent invocation of security classifications, points towards something that the people making classification decisions believe is genuinely sensitive. What would make underground features beneath the White House genuinely sensitive in a national security sense? If the features were simply old utility tunnels or drainage systems from the 19th century, there is no obvious security concern in acknowledging them. If the features were Cold War emergency infrastructure, much of that has already been publicly acknowledged in general terms. The sensitivity that seems to attach to the White House underground record is of a different character. It is the sensitivity that attaches to information about capabilities, vulnerabilities, and connections that the people responsible for the building's security do not want disclosed. That framing, capabilities, and connections points toward the possibility that what lies beneath the White House is not primarily historical, but operational. That the tunnel systems and underground features that have been found and classified are not relics of a past that no longer matters, but infrastructure that is in some sense still in use, or that reveals capabilities that current security planning still depends on. There is one more dimension to this story that the official history has never addressed. The city of Washington was designed according to a specific geometric plan, one that has been analyzed extensively by researchers interested in the symbolic dimensions of the Capitol's layout. Whether or not you find the esoteric interpretations of that layout persuasive, the mathematical precision of L'Enfant's design is not in dispute. The city was laid out with extraordinary geometric precision for an era before modern surveying technology. That precision extended underground in ways that are only now becoming apparent through geophysical survey data. The subsurface anomalies documented beneath the White House, the Treasury Department, the Capitol, and Lafayette Square appear, when plotted on a map, to fall along lines that are consistent with the geometric grid of L'Enfant's surface design. The underground features seem to mirror, at depth, the structure of the city above. If that correspondence is real and not coincidental, it suggests that whatever was built underground beneath Washington was built as part of the original design of the city, not as an afterthought or an improvisation. It suggests that the underground dimension of the federal city was planned from the beginning, built into the founding conception of the Capitol, and then gradually hidden as the political climate changed, and the original builders and their intentions became historical rather than contemporary. What was planned underground, by whom, and for what purpose, are questions that the official record has never answered, because the official record has consistently declined to engage with the underground question seriously. The buildings above ground have been documented, curated, and presented to the public with exhaustive care. The ground beneath them has been classified, exempted, and removed from public discussion every time someone has gotten close enough to ask the right questions. There is a figure who appears repeatedly at the edges of the White House underground story, never quite in the center of it, but close enough to be significant. His name was Major Benjamin Henry Latrobe, and he was the surveyor of public buildings for the United States from 1803 to 1817. Latrobe was responsible for the reconstruction of the White House after the 1814 burning, and he was one of the most technically sophisticated architects and engineers working in America at that time. In Latrobe's surviving correspondence and professional journals contain references to underground features he encountered during his work on federal buildings in Washington that do not appear in any of the official construction documents he submitted to Congress. In a letter to his son dated 1815, Latrobe described finding, during excavation work on the Capitol building's foundations, passages that he characterized as being of a construction he could not attribute to any known contractor or construction period in the building's history. He described them as appearing to predate the Capitol itself. This is a significant observation from a technically credible source. Latrobe was not a credulous observer. He was a professionally trained engineer with extensive experience in European and American construction practice. When he said he could not attribute a construction to any known source, he meant it in a technical sense. The materials, the jointing technique, the depth, and the orientation did not match anything in the documentary record he had access to. Latrobe's references to underground anomalies are scattered across his correspondence, rather than concentrated in any single document. Historians who have studied his papers have generally treated these references as peripheral curiosities, rather than central to his professional record. But read together. They suggest that Latrobe was aware of an underground dimension to the federal city that he found technically inexplicable and that he chose not to press publicly, because the political environment of the early republic was not one in which questions about the foundations of the nation's capital were welcome. His silence was professional discretion. But it preserved a gap in the record that has never been filled. The most recent episode in the White House underground story is also the least documented, which is itself revealing. During the construction of the security perimeter barriers that were installed around the White House grounds beginning in the late 2000s, significant excavation was required at multiple points around the building's perimeter. That excavation went to depths sufficient to encounter whatever is in the substrate beneath the grounds. Workers involved in those projects signed non-disclosure agreements as a condition of employment. The terms of those agreements, per accounts from people who were involved, but who spoke without attribution, were unusually broad. They covered not just classified security infrastructure, as would be standard, but also any underground features encountered during excavation, regardless of whether they appeared to be security-related. The breadth of that non-disclosure coverage is the tell. You do not require workers to agree not to discuss non-security-related underground features unless there is a reason to believe they might encounter such features, and a decision has been made in advance that those features need to be kept quiet. The scope of the agreement presupposes the existence of something worth covering. What workers on those projects encountered during excavation, if anything beyond the expected infrastructure, is not in the public record. The non-disclosure agreements have held, but the agreements themselves are a kind of negative evidence. They tell you that someone with the authority to make that decision decided that what might be found in the ground around the White House was sensitive enough to require advanced legal protection. That decision was made before the excavation began, which means it was not a reaction to discovering something unexpected. It was anticipation of discovering something expected. Someone knew what was down there. They just were not willing to say. The sealed record beneath the White House is not a conspiracy in the sense of a secret cabal maintaining a hidden truth against public interest. It is something more mundane and in some ways more disturbing. It is institutional reflex. The reflex of agencies and administrations that have inherited a classification structure they did not create and do not fully understand, applying security exemptions to information about the past, because that is what the classification structure tells them to do. But institutional reflex has consequences. The consequence here is that the physical history of the most important building in American public life is partially inaccessible to the public that nominally owns it. The ground beneath the White House belongs to the American people. What is in that ground? Who put it there? And why? For our questions that the American people have a legitimate interest in having answered. No president has spoken about the tunnels. Not one, across more than 2 centuries, has stood at a podium and said, "Here is what is under this building. Here is the full story of what the ground beneath our feet contains." The silence is not accidental. It is chosen, and the choice to maintain that silence, generation after generation, is itself a statement about what is down there. Some things are kept quiet because they are dangerous. Some things are kept quiet because they are embarrassing. And some things are kept quiet simply because the system that keeps them quiet has never been asked to stop. The tunnels are still there. The surveys have found them. The contractors have seen them. The classification exemptions have protected them. And the full story of what they are and what they were built for remains, for now, exactly where it has always been, below ground, out of sight, and officially unacknowledged. And that is the White House underground. 2 centuries of anomalous discoveries, classified survey data, undocumented brick tunnels, and a federal record system that responds to every serious question with a national security exemption. No president has spoken about it. The ground has spoken for them. What is down there was built for reasons that someone, across every administration, has decided the public does not need to know. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.